You're welcome to study session 8, Anarchism, its meaning and development. Introduction. This study session will introduce you to yet another body of ideas identified in political science as anarchism. The study session will explain the meaning of anarchism and highlight the perspectives that have developed within it. It will go further to outline developments within anarchism from the beginning to recent times. When you have studied this session, you should be able to define and use correctly the keyword printed in bold letters. Distinguish between anarchism and other political ideas. Identify two groups into which writers of anarchism as a body of political ideas could be divided, and identify the various developments in the literature on anarchism. We know that when you see anarchism, the first thing that comes to your mind is anarchy. It is indeed often the case that anarchism, which describes a political doctrine that exposes anarchy, is associated with chaos and lack of order. In other words, the two terms are associated with disorderly societies or entities on the verge of breaking down. Anarchism is a political philosophy which holds the state necessary, undesirable, unnecessary, or harmful. It is not surprising, therefore, that writers in Western Europe and North America tend to suggest that anarchism as a political idea arose in the West from the writings of disgruntled and frustrated leftists. The implication of this kind of argument is that anarchism is seen to portend something that is negative and destructive. There is a lot that is true in this particular view of anarchism. At our level, however, you will agree with us that we need a more balanced perspective on anarchism. On this, we are sure that some of you may wonder whether it is possible to have a balanced view of anarchism which has to do with chaos and disorder. Our reply will be that that kind of opinion is in fact one of reflex. In other words, such an attitude results in the fact that most of us are already biased to that popular definition of anarchism as the religion of violence and chaos. As students of political science, therefore, we need to be able to see beyond that kind of definition. The question, therefore, arises: what is anarchism? As we have indicated to you earlier, anarchism could be viewed as that body of political ideas which suggest that the best form of society is one in which there is an absence of government and other regulatory institutions. It is important to point out, however, that anarchism has its own positive dimensions. Also, it is necessary to indicate that proponents of anarchism have not always been those on the fringes of society. In other words, adherents have not always been those described as having little or nothing to lose were society to be destroyed. Let us make the two clarifications by beginning with the last one. One point that is clear is that anarchism does not necessarily preach that society be destroyed. Rather, it suggests that society will be better run when government and other regulatory institutions are abolished, or, at best, have most of their regulatory powers eliminated. In this regard, it is clear to you that it is wrong to see anarchism as a doctrine of only one particular segment of society. Take, for instance, our earlier example of Western societies. It is clear that anarchism cannot be identified only with socialists or other leftist writers. Within Western societies, anarchism has been identified with both leftist writers like Perry Joseph Proudhon and Michael Bakunin, and conservative writers like S.E. Parker and Henry David Thoreau. The leftist anarchists believe that since the state has become an instrument of exploitation and oppression, it has to be eliminated before mankind can record meaningful progress. On their own part, the conservative anarchists hinge their argument for the scrapping of the state on the need to create an environment in which each individual will be free to develop at his own pace according to his own ability. According to the conservatives, society can best be served when each individual is left to achieve whatever he can achieve, and not when the state continually strives to narrow the gaps between individuals. I am quite sure that by now you have been able to identify what I earlier called the positive dimension of anarchism. For leftist anarchists, this positive dimension emerges from their belief that government does not allow the individual to maximize the level of his contributions to the society. By removing government, therefore, the stumbling blocks on the path of the individual wishing to maximize his contributions to society would have been removed. In the same vein, for conservative anarchists, the positive dimension emerges on the belief that government hinders the optimal development of the individual. Positively, therefore, the less you have of government, the more the opportunity for optimal development of the individual. For all who uphold anarchism, the uniting theme is the need to fashion a social system that would enhance individual well-being. Whether or not their prescription is the right medicine is another question. The development of anarchism. In the last session, we tried to define anarchism. Now, let us examine how the literature on anarchism has developed over time. Like most of the other political ideas examined in this course, anarchism emerged as a reaction to certain developments in the society. In this instance, the major developments were the gradual strengthening of the state after the 30 Years' War and the Industrial Revolution. The 30 Years' War, which was terminated after the Peace Treaty of Westphalia in 1648, led to the emergence of the principle of the nation-state. It marked the beginning of the modern state as we know it today, that is, a territorially defined entity within whose boundaries a government exercised sovereignty over its inhabitants. The Industrial Revolution from around 1750 onward ensured that the state would emerge ever more powerful. It also ensured that certain peculiar problems would henceforth come up for resolution in society. Such problems included how the new wealth being created by the Industrial Revolution should be distributed. Another major problem was how the evils attendant on industrialization, pollution, exploitation of labor, urban squalor, increasing gap between the rich and the poor could be removed or ameliorated. It was in the context of the increasing power of the state and the various problems attendant on industrialization that anarchism emerged as a political idea. It was not surprising, therefore, that given the harsh realities of the earlier stages of the Industrial Revolution, the earlier proponents of anarchism tended to be socialistic in their writings. Subsequent writers became more and more nihilistic. General to both groups, however, is a streak of what we can call utopianism. Utopianism is a political principle that is premised on idealistic schemes of social perfection. We'll now examine each of these in turn. Note, however, that we are not suggesting that the tendencies are mutually exclusive. Socialism tendencies in early anarchism. It is not surprising that William Goldwyn, one of those to first write in the tradition that we now identify as anarchism, wrote within 40 years after the takeoff of the Industrial Revolution. His major argument was that the industrial age had created tyrannical government built upon the exploitation of man by man and unequal distribution of property. He therefore saw the need to replace the state with what he called several voluntary arrangements arrived at by individuals. Another anarchist, whose writings resulted from a sense of revulsion against the emergent capitalist system of the industrial age, was Proudhon. Writing in 1840, Proudhon condemned the economic system and made the famous statement that property is theft. He then called for the abolition of the state, which he saw as presiding over an unjust economic system. In place of the state, he also suggested the setting up of several independent associations that would work to decentralize authority in the society. Yet another writer in this tradition was Kropotkin, who wrote in the last decade of the 19th century. He argued that it was wrong for society to be run in favor of those considered to be the fittest. Rather, for him, the basis of any society was cooperation. For him, therefore, the best society was one run along communistic lines. In such society, there will be no division of labor or any economy based on monetary considerations. He therefore suggested the overthrow of the state in order for that kind of society to materialize. What is common to these three early writers is a concern for the inequalities brought about by the Industrial Revolution and an expressed desire for a new egalitarian society. In this sense, they were socialistic in their writings. Nihilistic tendencies in anarchism. Let us now examine some of the anarchists who laid much more emphasis on violence in their works. This trend had emerged by the 1860s at the height of the alienation and disruptions in social life that followed the maturing of the Industrial Revolution and political repression in Europe. One of the proponents was Dmitry Pisarev, who wrote the popular nihilist statement that what can be smashed must be smashed. Whatever will stand the blow is sound. What flies into smithereens is rubbish. At any rate, hit out right and left. No harm can or will come of it. Violence became something to be worshipped in itself. By the first decade of this century, another writer in this tradition, Georges Sorel, wrote a book, Reflections of Violence, outlining in detail how the working class could overthrow the capitalist state. So far, you have seen the socialistic and nihilistic dimensions of anarchism. What unites these two elements, however, is a view about the possibility of a better society emerging out of the ruins of existing society. In other words, anarchism has attempted to offer an alternative goal for human society better than what that society is at present. It not only does this, it also suggests means of achieving such a goal. In this manner, it offers a criticism of existing society and paints the picture of what is believed to be a better alternative in a future society free from the problems of today. For this reason, anarchism suffers the same faults identified with all utopian propositions. Since its proposed goal is apparently not yet in sight, it is now judged by the means that it suggests. In the 20th century, in which violence has become so endemic, and in which anarchism has become more and more identified with violence, it is not surprising that people tend to frown upon and avoid violence and anarchism. This study session informs you that anarchism is often identified as a body of ideas emanating from malcontents who preach disorder and chaos. However, we saw that anarchism is much more than this. It preaches that government and regulatory institutions be abolished or have their powers drastically curtailed because it believes that such institutions prevents the full development of the individual. The study session also discussed how anarchism emerged as a reaction to an apparent increase in the size and power of the state has developed along three lines that are not necessarily mutually exclusive. First, we have those writers who have been concerned about the inequalities of the industrial age. Such writers were more concerned with abuse of state power. Such writers have therefore emphasized the need for a violent overthrow of the state. Anarchism is now judged by its methods that two wrongs don't make a right, and for that, it has attracted opprobrium. We have now come to the end of Study Session 8. Thank you for listening.